Look, I know I've beat this drum, but this needs repeating. Back in August, Warner Bros. Discovery managed to turn themselves into one of the biggest dumpster fires in the medium of animation. You could say David Zaslav simply shot himself in the foot, but given the weight of his decisions, he practically nuked the whole leg off. And we all know what happened. The worst of his results was the infamous HBO Max purge. But much to my surprise, and probably others, there was one show that got more harsh treatment than the others. Can you guess which one? That's right, Infinity Train. For whatever reason, this was the show that they decided to beat left and right. Not only was the show taken from HBO Max, but the episodes were wiped from YouTube, and the DVDs were booted off of Amazon. But that didn't stop me from getting some of my own copies, so suck on that one, Zaslav! Actually, by the time I'm recording this, the DVDs just came back, and there are now more resources to let us watch the other seasons. I'm the type who prefers supporting the official release in any way we can, no matter how difficult companies like these will make it for us. So with these matters finally starting to clear up a little bit, I decided to flow with my curiosity and dip into the show, just to see if it was as good as everyone made it out to be. Plus, Atomic seems to have a lot of interest in the show, which just drove me even more to check it out. So, with the circumstances starting to show a brief silver lining, and thinking back to what everyone's been saying over these last few years, I gave it a fair shot. I found the pilot, I watched the first few episodes of Season 1, I found myself breezing through Season 2, then Season 3 and 4 in one sitting. Okay, fine, I love this show! And I can't believe I completely missed out on this. At this point, this has basically become a theme, growing attached to a cartoon either shortly before it ends or past the finale. First it was with Gravity Falls, then the Owl House, and now this show! What next? Amphibia? No, wait, we all know the answer by now, but that day will come in due time. So this show is a rather unique setup in different ways. The running point being that every episode has a 10-minute run, which we've seen for a number of shows in the past, but those are usually two back-to-back segments to fill a 20-minute time slot. And with this kind of show, the 10-minute run serves as a huge advantage for the story. The specific structure also helps the story's flow, which in this case I found to be a surprisingly perfected balance. Not too rushed, but also not too stretched out with excessive filler. So what is the story? Well, each season centers around one or two characters who get sucked onto the train. They have to redeem whatever problems they'd be facing, which is represented by a number on their hands. While traveling from car to car, they might get the chance to help others, or fight off threats or other obstacles, as a way to try and better themselves, which allows their number to shrink down until they get to 0, and gives them their own designated stop off the train and back to their respective homes. The story's formula may be simple, but there's a lot to appreciate from it. In some cases, what some of these characters have been through can be relatable in some ways. I mean, there were 4 seasons, with the main characters from each season facing different issues, and going through processes to learn from them and solve them. It kind of feels like self-therapy. Like I said, there were 4 seasons. Yes, only 4. Which is honestly devastating, considering that the show still had a fresh system. It could take a lot to bring it down, or drag it through seasonal rot. What I'm saying is that this show had more potential than those at Cartoon Network realized. There was so much more they could have done with it. So why was the show cancelled anyway? Well, from what I've gathered, Owen Dennis, the creator of the show, said he had plans to make a 5th season for Infinity Train, which was to focus on one of the biggest characters of the show, Amelia. However, they shot his story down as they wanted kid characters to remain in the spotlight. And that seems to have brought the show sinking down with him. And again, we all know what happened from there. So who's Amelia? And why is she so important? Well, I'd rather not say, at least not right now. I want to try to keep the spoilers to a minimum if I can help it. But with this kind of show, I can tell I'll have to plow through a few spoilers to progress through the story. So, you've been warned, folks. If you want to see all this for yourself, get to it. Otherwise, we're going in. Season 1, aka The Perennial Child, focuses on Tulip Olsen, an aspiring game designer who unfortunately struggles with the fact that her parents are divorced, which she learns to come to terms with after getting sucked into the Infinity Train. Exploring some of the many cars along with the friends she made on her trek, like One, a split-personality robot, with one of the personalities being voiced by Owen Dennis himself, and Atticus, King of the Corgis, voiced by Ernie Hudson. Oh yes, that Ernie Hudson.
If there's a steady paycheck in it, I'll believe anything you say.
Speaking of which, this show had other interesting choices for the cast. Just to name a few, there's Alfred Molina, Wayne Knight, and even J.K. Simmons. The story for the season had a bit of a light start compared to later events as a whole. I mean, sure, we meet other side characters like Randall and Samantha the Cat, and the main element started rising up after meeting Atticus. But for me, the story started to really pick up, in the crystal car. This was where we got to learn new things about Tulip and her past. Her past also seeps into the next episode, which I'll get to in a bit. The crystal car was visually appealing and gave us some unexpected surprises like the door being locked, which never happened before that point. And the true solution to opening the door was a rather pleasant twist. The other songs Tulip tried out felt like a nice bonus. It was kinda like a musical episode, which, as you all may know by now, is one of the biggest ways to win me over. At first I thought the crystal car was gonna be the show at its peak, that this episode was gonna be as good as it gets, but no. There was even more to this. A far deeper, more developed part of this journey underneath. The cat's car was able to provide a lot more in its own 10-minute slot than the average episode this season, as Samantha reveals these VHS tapes, which leads to other branches in the story and becomes one of the biggest elements in the whole show. While Samantha showing Tulip her tape, we got to see how the roots of Tulip's conflict all started, how she grew up and what led to her how she is now. This is a great example of the old show don't tell method. The way they show Tulip's backstory is so creative but also moving and emotional. Even if your parents aren't divorced, you can still understand how crushed she's been since then. But it still didn't stop there. Each passing episode proved to have its own impact, with one of the biggest examples of the season being the Chrome Car, where Tulip meets her own reflection, who will end up being very important in season 2. So of course Tulip found the conductor in the end, but the outcome was nothing like she expected. And this is where I start to seal my lips, because I don't want to give out too much even for the first season. This show's still pretty modern and still worth checking out on its own. All you need to know for now is that Tulip learned lessons. She improves in more ways than one, aside from the lessons she learned on the train. As I was watching through the season, I was wondering if Tulip's inner game skills were ever going to come into play, and my god, they sure did. It may not have been that frequent, but it was still enough to make it feel more worthwhile in the end. The first time was when she tried to beat the monsters with her characters, the other was way more clever and brave of her, as it helped her save Atticus. There's also some different running tropes we get in the show throughout the seasons, which Atomic reminded me of recently. Thanks again, man. And I feel these should be addressed before we move on. In each season, there's an interesting gimmick from within the openings and title drops. They all may be approached differently, but they still help fit in with each of the characters or the character the season's focused on. In the first season, for example, there's a load of mystery thrown in the first episode alone, and this transitions to later points in the season, which makes perfect sense as Tulip's completely new to this. She has no clue what's going on, and neither do we as viewers, since this is the first season, so no one knows what to expect, unless you've seen the pilot, but that's another topic for later. And I'll cover the rest of the themes during each season. So on to season 2. The Cracked Reflection. Unfortunately, we never get to see Tulip again, but like I said, her reflection plays an important role this season. And those of you who haven't seen the show yet might be staring at me like I'm spouting crazy talk. But this is an actual story arc. Tulip's reflection, or MT, or even Lake if you prefer, came to light in the Chrome Car. And that episode was the debut of not just her, but also her story arc leading up to the season. But even though Lake's more of the main focus this season, she's not the only one with problems this time. She runs into this kid named Jesse, whose problem centered around the way he's treated his brother. And with Lake's help, he has more of an advantage learning about his number and how to get rid of it. But this also annoys Lake. She wants to have a number of her own so she can leave the train, earn her freedom, become her own being, and make a name for herself. Which was the theme for season 2, the discovery of one's identity. However, this is actually harder than she thought. They won't solely give her her own number, just because they don't see her as a human? Man, that's harsh. And on top of that, she's got these flecks on her tail trying to kill her just for trying to be different from other reflections. Jeez, this was more messed up than expected. I know she tried to double-cross Tulip in her debut, but she really didn't deserve all this. However, there's a happy climax to this. Even though Jesse got rid of his number and got his way out earlier than expected, he cared enough to go back and save Lake. That is so sweet. Seeing how he's been around Lake this whole time, the outcome was surprisingly mysterious. I mean, I know he liked her, but I still didn't think he'd have it in him to go through the trouble. Heck, I didn't even know it was possible in the first place. But he took his chances, and they both got a happy ending too. That was just so nice, and it led to another satisfying closure. There's only one slight criticism I have with this season. It's that Jesse's personality didn't seem as fleshed out as Tulip's was. Sure, there were still some similarities between them. There were family issues like Tulip with her parents and Jesse with Nate. That was a strong detail. But as for their skills, I feel they could have gone a little further with Jesse. With Tulip, for example, she used what she learned from game programming to save Atticus, and that came off as a great solution to that character trait. As for Jesse, he said he has an interest in swimming, which became an advantage for him, but only once, and then it's never really brought up again. which was a little disappointing. You'd think he'd use that skill to do something bigger, like something that would have left a bigger impact, like what Tulip did. But regardless, it was still another good season overall. Season 3, Cult of the Conductor, takes on more of a twist than the first 2 seasons. The season focuses on the Apex, the gang attacking the carnival back in Season 2. This takes the story in a completely different direction, as Grace and Simon, the top members of the Apex, are under the impression that they need to increase their numbers, as they feel it helps give them a sign of dominance, believing that the train practically belongs to them, and that they can do whatever they want. All this was mostly due to them being stuck on the train for most of their lives without any proper guidance, besides seeing a form of the conductor as kids. So they were stuck figuring everything out for themselves, which led to this messed up assumption. They convinced the kids with this kind of thought process too, and as you probably guessed, to them this translates to, they need to act as nasty as possible. This philosophy especially sticks to Simon. You'll see throughout the season he's one of the most pugnacious, harsh, stubborn, despicable, and all around just most unlikable characters imaginable. And sure, he has his reasons, after Samantha neglected him as a kid, but it's plain to see that he can go too far, and way more than he should. He's constantly starting fights without thinking about Grace reconsidering her life choices. He turns the gang against her, and even resorts to actual murder. I'm not even kidding. This kind of show having actual murder, and sure we've seen it before with Flake and the Flex, but Tuba was a natural animal. My god! Even when Amelia comes back to try and set them straight, he still goes on acting huffy and blaming everyone around him. Every time he appeared on screen, I kept saying, come on, give this jerk some consequences. Break up with him, tell him off. I want to see some punishment! As for Grace, she's the one the season focuses on. She's the one who has her own development and decides to put in the effort to improve herself. But she doesn't come to that decision alone. Her motivation starts picking up when she and Simon meet Tuba and Hazel. I've said this before a long time ago, but there are times I can give off a cranky old man vibe, as I tend to be easily ticked off by kid characters, especially around Hazel's age demographic. But thankfully she was able to prove herself to be quite an exception. In fact, I dare say this season needed her. I can't imagine Grace's redemption would have even gone off the ground without her. Or at least it wouldn't have started off as well as it did. It was Hazel who gave Grace the nudge she needed to find that form of empathy. Simon started off looking like a loyal friend, but he turned out to be nothing more than just a bad influence who got worse over time. However, after some rather disturbing but well-deserved karma, Grace is left on her own to guide the Apex toward their own redemption. And even though the outcome might have been a little unclear, this was still quite a unique season, with a memorable adventure. Also, when I thought the Crystal Car was going to be the only musical episode we'd get, this season proved me wrong by the first episode, the musical car, and I loved the presentation. It gave an interesting first impression, leading all the way up to just as interesting a finale. So all this brings us to Season 4, Duet. Now this season was noticeably more different than the first 3. Looking back on the previous seasons, they all had a connection which made up a pattern. About halfway through one season, we'd get to meet a new character, or characters, and the next season would focus on said characters. Season 1 led to Lake, who became the main focus in Season 2. Then Season 2 led to Grace, who became the main focus in Season 3. You see in the system? Season 4, on the other hand, didn't play into the pattern. Instead, we got to meet completely new characters from out of the blue. But that's okay, because they found other ways to help make this season just as neat and memorable. There's another difference that I'm shocked I didn't catch on until much later, is that this season was a prequel. I really should have known that after getting a look at Amelia. I mean, look at her. She looks much younger than before. Besides that, she also gets along with 1-1 a bit better, or so it seems, as she gives off implications leading to actions that we've already seen her play out. But the fact that this is a prequel also raises a question. Cass seemed like one of the most adventurous partners we got to see in the show, but there was no sign or mention of her before this point. I guess it was just the writer suddenly adding her into the story up to that point and never came up with her character beforehand, which I'm assuming that's why we didn't see her in the earlier seasons. But speaking of partners, whatever happened to the other side characters from the earlier seasons? You'd think they would have gotten some closure of their own. Think about it. You ever wonder what happened to Atticus, or Hazel, or Ellen Dracula? Or what about the rest of the Apex? Did they ever make it out? Well, no matter. Despite the differences, there's still plenty of story to help run the season as well as the last 3. For the first surprise this season, the story centers around 2 guys who grew up together, Ryan and Min-gi. Unfortunately, they ended up leaning toward different lives later on. And once they got sucked onto the train, they got their numbers as usual. But much unlike the previous passengers we've seen, not only were their numbers exactly the same, but they also moved at the exact same rate too. Their destinies were practically linked together, which kept things interesting, as we've never seen the numbers behave this way before. Like I said, these two ended up living different lives, which leads to a few disagreements and arguments, even to their starting point on the train. Normally, I'd hate to point fingers, but yeah, it was mostly Ryan's fault this happened in the first place. Ming-Gi was minding his business for the most part, but at the same time, I can also see Ryan's side to this. Ming-Gi should have loosened up at times. I mean, he did end up ditching Ryan when he needed him. And since I'm pointing fingers anyway, the obstacles and enemies they have to run from was all Kez's doing, after she causes some mayhem and confusion in the different cars. And she was using the guys as a form to escape. Besides that, a majority of these cars can also lead to tasks that can convince the boys to resort to teamwork and put aside their differences, until they get to meet Morgan and have to find a way to get away from her just to make it off the train once and for all. Which you can tell they do, and this leads to a smoother future the friends can share together. Sounds like there were quite the adventures all the main characters had so far, huh? Sounds like there were still so many things they could have done with this concept, at least before it starts wearing out, but that could have taken a while, right? Well, I hate to say it, but this happens to be where the ride ends. Despite the staff planning to keep the show afloat, Season 4 ended up being the final season. It's more than fair to say that Infinity Train was one of those shows that fits into the category of an experience unlike any other. I love it when shows do this kind of stuff, provide amusing moments, as well as various insights that get you to think in one sitting. And the unique details these shows give us make them feel even more memorable. With this show especially, with all the different worlds we got to see throughout the cars, sometimes it felt like I was watching Yellow Submarine. And that's one of my all-time favorite movies. But I also hate it when I end up missing out on these shows. This has happened multiple times in the past, and it just leaves a painful feeling to know that something you didn't think much of at first glance would turn into an exciting adventure, filled with lovable characters and memorable journeys, and lessons to be learned, whether relatable and or touching, only to find out that you're too late, the show's on its last stand, or worse, it already ended. And while I blame myself for that, I also blame the corporate schmucks who cut these shows' legacy shorter than planned. But in this case, it hurts even more when I'm reminded how harsh David Zaslav was toward this show as of late. Oh, and Dennis, you poor guy. I'm sorry you and the rest of the team had to deal with this. And like I said at the start, there was a story planned for Season 5, but it still didn't stop there. According to Dennis, they had a whole layout of potential stories, enough to last for 8 seasons! But alas, it all got cut halfway. Plain and simple, Infinity Train really deserved better. It's amazing to look back on the pilot, even if it was technically just a teaser for Season 1, but it's still amazing to see how far the show got fleshed out from that short. And again, there was more to offer than what we saw, but now it seems like we'll never get to see all the other plots and adventures come to light. Maybe someday Cartoon Network will give Owen Dennis another chance to keep the show going. But even if they remain too stubborn to give him said chance, hopefully they'll give him a chance to make a new show and impress the executives and the audience as much as he did with Infinity Train. I mean, they are aware of his talent. They've seen what he's done for regular show, and they've seen what he's done with Infinity Train, so we can still hope that he'll be able to blow us away again in the future with something new. But something just as intriguing as Infinity Train. And preferably this will come at a time when the WB Discovery idiots learn from their mistakes and stop screwing everyone over through HBO Max. As well as stop screwing everyone over in general, but we'll soon see. Won't we?